Today we're going to talk about using the jewelry saw to cut shapes out of your copper plates so that you can make shaped plate etchings. You can see this one we've already got that we're working on, and here we've got a blank one that we're about to get started on. So you can see I've already got a hard ground on my plate and it's ready to go. This is my image that I'm going to work from and cut out. So I've got this kind of taped on here relatively where I want it. And the first thing we're gonna do is use this transfer paper. I like this Surreal transfer paper. The one I like to use is the yellow. You can see I've got a small piece of it here. What you're gonna wanna do to transfer your image, this is pretty basic, so if you already know how to do this, you can just skip ahead. We're gonna use the kind of dusty, bright side, not the dull side. We're gonna put that down because that's gonna be the side that transfers. So I'm just going to use a couple of pieces of tape to secure that under my drawing. Oops. And then I'm going to flip this back over. And okay, I might need another piece of tape. I like to just tape everything down so that I can move it around and it's nice and secure and it's not going to go anywhere while I transfer it. So, right now I'm just going to be focusing on the basic outline that I want to transfer and cut out. I'm not going to put any of my detail work into the plate yet until after I do the cutting, because we can scuff the plate a little bit while we cut, and you want to be able to steel wool everything down to a nice clean surface before you work on any details. Oops. Okay, so you can see that transferred pretty nicely. Pretty basic little outline there. So now I'm just going to use my tool to just draw a single line. Try to not do any scribbling or anything, just do one really confident contour line, because we're going to etch this really deep so that the jewelry saw can kind of lock into where we want to cut it. So basically, I just drew every line that I intend to cut. That way, I can etch it kind of deep, give myself a little bit of a guide for cutting. If you are feeling kind of lazy, you don't have to do this step. You could just draw it on there and go for it with the cutting, but I find it works a lot better if you etch it first. Here, before we put some stuff in the acid, what we want to do is protect the back of the plates. So you can see a lot of them are naked copper, and we can exhaust our acid pretty quickly and create a lot of unwanted sediment in the acid if we don't cover that. So we're just going to use a little bit of contact paper. You can get this at a hardware store or wherever you want to go. So basically, I just cut a small piece. So I usually make it just a little bit bigger than my plate. So I just put that face up with sticky side up, kind of line it up like this, and let it fall on there. Obviously I don't want to put my finger grease in the lines that I just drew, but you want to kind of tap it down. And it's okay if there's like a little bit of bubbles, you just want to make sure it's nice and sealed on the edges so that it's not going to allow any acid to touch the back of the plate. And sometimes I'm going to just trim off any kind of excess. Doesn't have to be perfect. Okay. So when we're thinking about etching these plates, obviously these are two plates that we would want to etch for separate times. here, like a normal etching, we would want to preserve detail, but for this one, we're obviously going to cut along all of these lines, so it doesn't really matter if it's very detailed. We want it to be a really deep bite. So I usually like to etch things for 2 hours or so. It makes my life a lot easier. The little blade is so small that it will kind of follow that etched line. So here I've got my plate. I etched it for about an hour and a half. I definitely recommend going a little bit longer than that, but this will work. You can see I've got here, this is a bench pen. This is just like a basic one that you can get. A lot of times I don't even use it and I just hang it off the edge of the table, but for the sake of being proper, I'm going to use the bench pen. These are pretty cheap. You can get one from Rio Grande. You can see this is a really good jewelry supply website, Rio Grande, that you can grab saw blades for. I'm using currently 18 gauge copper from Tackage Press. So I'm using a number 2 blade, which corresponds with the 18 gauge copper. Sometimes I use number 1 or number 3 as well. I'm gonna link a table that will show you the corresponding blade size to the copper gauge. So just make sure you know which gauge copper that you're using, and then you can choose your saw blade based on that. So this is a little saw frame that you can also get from Rio Grande. I think Tackage carries them now too. And the main thing that you want to notice, this blade has really, really tiny teeth, and you want to make sure that they're pointing down and out. So when you loosen these little screws here, you're going to slide that in and make sure that your teeth are pointing down and that everything is nice and tight. Here you can see also, like, if it's a little bit loose, you can kind of push this up and tighten it again. Okay, now we're ready to get started. The thing to consider with the saw blade, as we said, the teeth point down. So the blade only actually cuts on the downstroke. So if you're pushing against the copper on the upstroke, you're gonna dull or break your blade more easily. Don't be discouraged if you break some blades when you first start. I broke a million blades when I was learning how to do this. So basically what you want to make sure that you're doing is that you have the saw blade at a 90-degree angle all the time. If you try to cut at an angle like this or like this, you're going to end up breaking or dulling the blade, and really you want to just focus on having that like nice vertical stroke down. So it's going to feel really slow. So you can see that we've been following that line and that it's nestling into that pre-etched line really nicely as we cut. Okay, my blade is starting to get a little bit dull and gross, which happens. So you can see I just unscrewed the top screw, and I'm just gonna pull it straight down. And I'm going to put that one over here because it's gross, and grab a new blade. Same thing, pointy side down. Finagle it into the spot that you're already at. So you can see how we've been following this line really nicely, and my blade just got a little dull, so I'm going to change it out. But something else you could see here is the reason that I cut it with the ground still on it is because a lot of times I have a tendency to slip and hit the plate with the top of this nut, so it makes some marks. So the ground just provides one more layer of protection on the actual copper and less things for us to seal wool out when we get started with our drawing. This is the other reason that I don't like to do the drawing before I cut, because the saw itself can kind of mangle the copper a little bit, and it's nice to cut before you draw. Okay, so in order to get the holes on the inside, the first thing we're going to do is use our little drill. I've got a drill bit that's just, you know, a little bit bigger than my saw blades. And I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to make sure that I'm not too close to the edge. I like to put 2 holes in each piece I want to cut out. It kind of helps me to be able to put the saw blade and have options for where I want to cut from. You can see also that I have like a little bit of distance between the lines, that way I'm not kind of going into my future bevel or anything. Be sure that you drill into a piece of wood, that way you're not drilling into the table or into whatever surface you're using. Okay, so for this part I've got my holes drilled where I want to cut the piece out of the center. I'm going to detach the top part of the blade and thread it through these pre-drilled holes. You can, if at this point, especially if you're using a larger plate, especially cutting something big, that there are larger size saw blades. This has a little bit less control, but you can reach further. So just in case you start to snag the back of the plate, you can switch to a larger saw frame. And there's frames between these 2 sizes as well. Okay, so it is very difficult to turn around with this, so at this point I usually detach it and pull it out. It's a lot easier to cut up to the corners than to try and turn the blade around. A lot of times you'll end up kind of just scraping it around and it doesn't work very well. Don't be afraid to do it the easy way. Like, if it seems easier to you to pull it out and rethread it multiple times, now that we've made the rough cuts on our little eyeball plate here, we're gonna have to bevel it. So standard etching procedure wants you to bevel the edges of the plate. Obviously this is a really sharp edge now, and we want to clean it up to make it look a little softer anyway. So what we're gonna do is bevel the outside just like normal, but then for the inside holes, we've got these little micro files, which are really quite accessible. You can get them at any hardware store or on just like Amazon or something. They come in lots of different shapes. You can see this is my favorite one. It has kind of a flat side on one side and a little bit of a curve on the other side. So if you're on the inside of something. So I'm just gonna start with my big file to get the basics of the outside. I like to, at this point you could take the ground off if you wanted to, but I kind of like filing with the black because then you're kind of revealing your bevel and it helps you see kind of what you're doing. So you can see what I'm talking about here, where now I've kind of revealed this bevel and you can kind of help see where the shape is gonna end up. because of the kind of contrast to the black and copper. You can use the file to kind of knock down any extra funky stuff. And I'm going to round the edges of this eye. And so you can kind of see that actually in this lighting it looks really nice. So you can see the bevel on the outside, and it kind of helps you to be able to see where you're going and how your filing looks. It looks really nice and even here, and the outside looks nice and filed. Now we're going to do the inside. So the same thing, it's going to like thread through this little eyeball. We're going to try our best to retain that 45-degree angle. Yeah, so you can see the bevel kind of appears as a like copper ring around there, and it helps you to be able to see kind of how it looks and fix a few things. The solvent I like to use to take big ground off, I've tried a bunch of things, but this citrus strip, which you can get at Home Depot, it also comes in a gel, but I really like the spray. This is my favorite so far. So I like to kind of give a good coating on the whole plate. Should look like it has an orange halo. And then I usually wait like 1 or 2 minutes and let that cook a little bit. So after it sits for a little bit, I like to use a toothbrush to abrade the ground, and you can see that it's gonna melt right off. So this solvent works great because it's citrus based, so it's not going to give you any harmful odors, but it also removes the ground relatively quickly, whereas a lot of the other non-toxic solvents I found moved pretty slow. So this stuff gets pretty gross, so I like to use paper towels instead of rags. So at this point I'm just going to slowly kind of remove the ground and get as much of that goo off as I can. And then before you do anything else, you're going to want to grab some Simple Green, which is going to help you get the rest of that stuff off. It really helps the whole shape to just steel wool the whole thing. That's also going to get rid of any like scratches or things like that that we don't want. So I use a little bit of 3-in-1 oil and steel wool. The one that I use is quadruple 00000. I'm also kind of hitting the edges too where I filed, just to kind of give it even a little bit more smoothing to the edges that I cut. Okay, so you can see I just degreased this plate. Now I have cut, filed, steel wooled, and degreased it, so it's ready to receive a ground for the actual drawing. I'm going to use the big hard ground, the ink-based ground. Once I've got it spread out really nicely, it's the same thing. Watch out because these little ones have a tendency to move around a good bit, so I tend to push a little harder. That's satisfying. That looks pretty good. So you want to make sure it's not too thick. It looks really good on this one too. It's important to note that these shaped plates have a tendency to cook a lot faster because there's less surface area, even though it feels like a bigger plate. Maybe subtract a minute and keep your eye on the plate. After you cut and file the plate, you can steel wool everything to a nice surface, and then it's ready to draw on like this. So now we're also going to etch this plate and print it. Alright, it's not totally going to fit. It's a little weird when there's lots of little bits. You know, there's a lot of edges where acid could seep in. Just to keep the consistency, I like to kind of do a little bit of a kind of burnish from the back with my hands. You don't want to like turn the plate upside down or anything at this point because the drawing is obviously very delicate. And I'm ready to move over to the acid station. This is a really simple etching setup that I use pretty often. I used this a lot when I wanted to etch small things relatively quickly. I just have like a large bin with a smaller tray of acid in it with also a tray of water. So the tray of water is going to allow me to do a rinse that's contained, so I'm not going to get acid anywhere outside my little bin. The last thing I'm going to do before I'm ready to print this is sometimes the ground and all the things that we've done to it have a tendency to kind of get into those little fine lines. Mm-hmm. So I have this Cresol degreasing bath, which is a watered down version of this. This is the Cresol CMF 240 degreaser. It's an enzyme-based degreaser. Not gonna hurt your hands or anything, but it will completely clean and almost reset your plates. So you can see that it's a clear liquid, but it has a tendency to turn black as it picks up all of the sediment and gross stuff from your plates. If you have nail polish on, this will kind of take off your nail polish. So if you do have nail polish that you care about, wear gloves. I usually leave it in this bath for about 15 minutes, just until you see it kind of brighten up and all the ink looks like it's out of the lines. To register shaped plates, it's relatively easy. It's pretty similar to how you would register a regular plate. We're going to use a piece of frosted mylar here, and I'm going to set up a registration to print this plate on an 8x10 piece of paper. On this, we have the frosted mylar, so it's kind of rough and frosted on one side and glossy on the other side. So we are going to actually draw the registration upside down on the frosted side and then print from the glossy side so that we can clean it off. Tape it down a little bit while I'm going to draw the registration, just so that it doesn't move around while I'm trying to draw all my lines and stuff. First, I'm just going to draw the boundary of the outside of the print. I find that it really helps to use one of these mats with the grid on it. Very gently, I'm going to turn it upside down and make the registration upside down. I'm going to have kind of 2.5 inches on each side here, so it's nice and centered. So now we've got that glossy surface, so we can, if ink gets on this, we can clean it with alcohol without worrying. And And this is just going to stiffen the ink a little bit, which helps a lot with the shaped plate. You're going to get a little bit of a more contrast with your detail, and it's going to stick in your lines a little bit better, and you won't have it bleeding off the edge or kind of being too goopy with your shaped plate. And you can do this with any color. I would just recommend making it a little tiny bit stiffer than you usually print with. In these little negative spaces, the ink's obviously going to bleed out, so it helps if you can card it on a piece of paper and then just move it. That way you're not getting it all over the slab. At this point, it's ideal if you can hold the plate still so that it doesn't slip around, because the more it slips around, the more you're going to get ink on the back of your plate, and that's not ideal. Alright, so at this point I'm going to do a little gentle wipe. I'm not trying to get it too perfect. I'm just trying to get a good amount of the residual stuff off the surface. That looks pretty tight. The secret that worked really well for me was to halfway wipe it and then kind of flip it upside down on the fresh newsprint and kind of wipe it a little bit aggressively on the edges from the back. And especially right now it's relatively clean, but like 10 prints in, when the back looks a little funky, this really helps to make sure you're not going to have anything on all of those edges that's going to bleed out and make your embossment look bad. I then usually wipe the rest of it in my hand so that I can kind of cradle it and move it around. See my image starting to emerge. Can you see it? I drew like a little snake around this sword. Water for probably 10 minutes or so. And put it down, tuck it in a little bit, and here you can see this is the back of the paper because there's a little bit of a laid grid pattern on there. The front looks more organic.